Me, Sam, project manager at a decent-sized engineering firm. Been here for maybe 8 years, something like that. Not a genius coder or a hardware guru, but I know how to talk to both the clients and the engineers without making either group want to jump out of a window. Basically, I translate business needs into technical tasks and keep the trains running on time. Our department was the company's bread and butter. We handled the legacy systems for our biggest clients. It wasn't glamorous work, no flashy new apps or bleeding-edge tech. It was about stability. These systems handled millions of transactions a day, and our job was to make sure they never, ever went down. The head of our division was a guy named Victor. Victor was probably in his late 50s. He'd been with the company since the beginning. He literally wrote parts of the original code that the entire business was built on. The guy looked permanently tired, always had a coffee stain on his shirt, but his mind was a steel trap. You could walk up to him with a problem that had stumped 3 senior engineers for a week, and he'd just stare into the middle distance for a minute, sip his cold coffee, and then tell you exactly which line of code was causing the issue. He wasn't big on pleasantries or corporate speak. He cared about one thing. Does it work? Our team reflected his attitude. It was a classic old boys club, only in the sense that most of the guys had been there for over a decade. They were pros. They knew the systems inside and out. There was no drama, no office politics. Just a bunch of guys focused on doing their job right. We had our routines, morning coffee, a quick meeting to go over tickets, then heads down work until lunch. The atmosphere was relaxed because we were competent. We hit our deadlines, we exceeded our service level agreements, and our clients loved us for it. The money was rolling in and life was stable. Then the old CEO retired. The board of directors decided the company needed to modernize its image. That was the first sign of trouble. A few weeks later, an all-hands meeting was called. An email went out introducing our new CEO, Stella. Her picture was in the email. Big smile, sharp business suit. The bio was a masterclass in corporate buzzwords. Talked about her background in business administration, her passion for disruptive innovation, and building inclusive corporate ecosystems. Didn't mention a single thing about engineering. The day of the meeting, the whole company gathered in the main conference hall. Stella walked on stage and just radiated this intense, almost aggressive energy. She started her speech by thanking the board for the opportunity to steer this ship into the future. Then she started talking about the company's culture. She said that while the company had been financially successful, it had stagnated culturally. She spoke about the need to dismantle ingrained legacy structures and patriarchal frameworks. I remember looking over at Victor. He was just sitting there, arms crossed, with a completely blank expression. He wasn't impressed. She announced her first major initiative, a complete top-to-bottom cultural audit to identify and eliminate sources of workplace toxicity. A chill went through the room. We all knew what that meant. The next Monday, the changes began. Posters went up all over the office, pastel colors with generic slogans about teamwork and respect. Emails started flying out from a newly created Office of People and Culture. The first one announced mandatory weekly workshops for all male employees. The topic, unpacking your privilege and deconstructing toxic masculinity. Victor's entire team, myself included, had to attend. The first session was a joke. Some consultant, a woman in her late 20s, tried to explain to a room full of middle-aged engineers how their very presence created an intimidating environment for others. One of the senior guys, a quiet man who spent his weekends building ships and bottles, asked a simple question about what specific behaviors were considered toxic. The consultant couldn't give a straight answer. She just kept repeating vague phrases like non-inclusive language and subtle power dynamics. Victor sat in the back of the room, silent, just observing. After the workshop, he pulled me aside in the hallway. He told me to keep my head down, do my work, and not to engage. Just document everything. He saw where this was going long before the rest of us did. Stella started making operational changes. She brought in her own people to fill newly created executive roles. A chief synergy officer, a vice president of inclusivity and belonging. None of them had any technical background. Their job was to enforce the new culture. They started inserting themselves into our project meetings. They would question our technical decisions, not on their merit, but on their inclusivity. I I remember one meeting where we were discussing a database migration. It was a complex, high-risk project. Victor was laying out the plan, explaining the need for extensive testing and a phased rollout to minimize downtime. The new VP of Inclusivity interrupted him. She asked if the term master-slave in database architecture was necessary. She suggested we spend time finding an alternative terminology before proceeding with the project. The room went silent. You could see the veins on Victor's forehead pulsing. He just slowly said, "That is the industry standard term. It has no meaning beyond its technical function. We are not changing our plan." The VP wrote something down in her notebook and gave him a cold look. I knew right then that Victor was a marked man. Stella started doing listening tours, where she would meet with small groups of employees without their managers present. After her tour of our department, the rumors started that our team was a boys' club, that we were resistant to change, that our casual, direct way of communicating was a form of microaggression. They were twisting our greatest strength, our efficiency and lack of drama, into a weakness. The breaking point came a month or two later. We were in the planning stages for a major system overhaul for our biggest client. It was a multi-million-dollar project, scheduled to take over a year. Victor and his team had spent months architecting a solution. It was solid, reliable, and built on proven technology. They presented the plan to Stella and her new executive team. Victor walked them through the architecture, the risk mitigation strategies, the resource allocation. It was a masterclass in project planning. When he finished, Stella just smiled. She thanked him for his thorough, traditional approach. Then she projected a new slide onto the screen. It was a completely different plan. It involved scrapping Victor's entire architecture and rebuilding the system from scratch using a bunch of new, trendy, but unproven technologies. Her reasoning? The new technologies were more forward-thinking and would look better on the company's marketing materials. Victor was stunned. He tried to explain, calmly at first, why her plan was a recipe for disaster. He pointed out the lack of skilled personnel to work with these new technologies, the massive security risks of using unvetted open-source libraries for a financial system, the fact that it would double the project timeline and triple the budget. Stella didn't listen to a word he said. She just kept repeating that the company needed to embrace the future and move away from outdated monolithic systems. The argument got heated. Victor, for the first time since I'd known him, raised his voice. He told her that her plan wasn't just risky, it was reckless, that she was gambling with the company's most important client relationship out of pure vanity. Stella's face turned to stone. She stood up and said, "Victor, I appreciate your passion, but your resistance to innovation is exactly the kind of toxic gatekeeping attitude I was hired to eliminate." She ended the meeting right there. The next morning, Victor's access card didn't work. He was called into a meeting with HR and one of Stella's new VPs. They fired him on the spot. The official reason was insubordination and creating a hostile work environment. The news spread through the office like a shockwave. Nobody could believe it. They had fired the one person who actually knew how everything worked. That afternoon, two of Victor's most senior engineers, guys with over 20 years of combined experience, walked into HR and resigned in protest. By the end of the week, 3 more were gone. It was a bloodbath. The institutional knowledge of the entire department was walking out the door. I was terrified. I had a mortgage and a family. I couldn't just quit. I decided to follow Victor's advice. Head down, do the work, document everything. Stella moved fast to replace the people who had left. She didn't post the jobs externally. She hired people from her personal network and through recruiters that specialized in diversity and inclusion placements. The new team was different. They were all young, enthusiastic, and had impeccable LinkedIn profiles filled with the right buzzwords. But they couldn't code their way out of a paper bag. They had theoretical knowledge from their university courses, but zero practical experience with large-scale, mission-critical systems. I was now the manager of a team that had lost 80% of its experience and replaced it with novices. My job became impossible. The new hires were arrogant. They looked down on the old systems, calling them dinosaurs. They refused to read the existing documentation, claiming they wanted to start fresh without being constrained by the past. Simple tasks that would have taken the old team an afternoon were now taking weeks. I'd find them arguing for hours in a meeting room, about which new JavaScript framework to use for an internal admin tool, while critical client tickets were going unanswered. The system's stability, once our trademark, began to crumble. Small outages at first, a server needing a manual reboot, a process that would hang and need to be killed. Things the old team would have anticipated and prevented. I tried to mentor the new team. I scheduled knowledge transfer sessions, trying to walk them through the complexities of the architecture. They were either dismissive or just didn't get it. They would nod along and then an hour later make a change to a production environment without testing it, taking down a whole module. Stella, meanwhile, was in her element. She was getting praise in business magazines for boldly transforming her company's culture. She was giving talks at conferences about how to lead with empathy and smash the glass ceiling. She was completely disconnected from the reality of what was happening in her own engineering department. She saw the project reports I sent her, the ones that were getting redder and redder with missed deadlines and budget overruns. But she had an answer for everything. The delays were expected growing pains. The budget issues were necessary investments in modernization. The client complaints were just resistance to a new way of working. The big project, the system overhaul for our top client, was now being run by her hand-picked team. They threw out Victor's plan and started from scratch, just like she wanted. It was a slow-motion train wreck. They made fundamental architectural mistakes that I, a non-engineer, could spot from a mile away. They spent weeks building features the client never asked for, while ignoring the core requirements. I tried to raise the alarm. I sent detailed emails to Stella, outlining the specific technical risks and the probable points of failure. My emails were ignored. I tried to talk to her in person. I'd catch her in the hallway and try to explain the severity of the situation. She would just give me a condescending smile and say something like, "Sam, I know change is hard, but you need to trust the process and empower your new team." It was like talking to a brick wall. The client was getting nervous. Their project lead, a guy we'd worked with for years, started calling me on my personal cell. He was asking why his simplest questions weren't being answered, why the project updates were so vague, why the demo environments were constantly broken. I had to lie to him. I had to make excuses for my team's incompetence, because I knew that telling the truth would get me fired. It felt awful. We were a company that had built its reputation on trust and reliability, and I was being forced to betray that. Things came to a head around 6 months after Victor was fired. The new team was supposed to deliver the first major milestone of the new system. They had promised the client a working prototype with several key features. The week before the deadline, it was obvious they had nothing. The code was a mess, nothing integrated properly. It barely even compiled. The new lead engineer, a guy who had Agile Visionary in his email signature, assured me it would all come together in the end. He said they were just in the messy middle of the creative process. I knew we were heading for a cliff. I made a decision. I couldn't let the company and my own career go down without a fight. I spent an entire weekend at home, locked in my office. I went through every project document, every email, every server log, every client complaint from the last 6 months. I compiled it all into a single, undeniable report, a timeline of failure. It showed the system's performance metrics before and after the firings, a steady, stable line that suddenly fell off a cliff. It showed the number of critical bugs reported per week, going from single digits to hundreds. It showed the budget, with a chart demonstrating how the new team had burned through 70% of the funds to deliver less than 10% of the work. It included anonymous, redacted quotes from the client's increasingly frantic emails. It was a 30-page document of pure, cold, hard facts. There was no emotion, no opinion, just data. On Monday morning, I requested an urgent one-on-one meeting with Stella. Her assistant tried to push me off for a few weeks, but I insisted, saying it was a critical business risk. I finally got 15 minutes with her at the end of the day. I walked into her huge corner office. She was sitting at her desk, typing on her laptop, and didn't even look up for a full minute. Finally, she closed her laptop and gave me a tight, impatient smile. "Sam, you said this was urgent." I didn't say a word. I just placed a printed copy of the report on the desk in front of her. She looked down at the cover page, then back at me. Her smile vanished. I said, "You need to read this. The project is going to fail. We're going to lose our biggest client. This is the evidence." She picked up the report. She didn't open it. She just felt the weight of it in her hands. She stared at me for what felt like an eternity. I could see the gears turning in her head. I thought for a second that I might have gotten through to her, that the sheer weight of the data would force her to see reason. I was wrong. She placed the report back on the desk, very deliberately. She looked me dead in the eye and said, "I understand what this is. This is a pathetic attempt from the remnants of the old guard to sabotage my vision." I was speechless. She went on. "You've been undermining the new team from the beginning. Your resistance to change has been a constant drag on progress. It's clear you're not a good fit for the new culture we're building here." She stood up. "This document," she said, tapping the report with one long fingernail, "is proof that you're part of the problem. Thank you for making it so clear for me. You can see yourself out." I just stood there for a second, completely defeated. I had laid out the undeniable truth in front of her, and she had twisted it into an attack on her ideology. The facts didn't matter. The risk to the company didn't matter. All that mattered was her narrative. I turned and walked out of her office without another word. I went back to my desk, packed up my personal belongings, and walked out of the building. I knew I was going to be fired the next day, and I didn't want to give them the satisfaction of escorting me out. As I drove home, I didn't feel angry. I just felt empty. I had done everything I could. I had tried to save them from themselves. Now, all I could do was watch it burn. The next morning, I got the call from HR. It was a short, formal conversation. My position had been terminated, effective immediately. They told me my final paycheck would be mailed and my belongings would be couriered to my house. I just said, "Okay, thank you," and hung up. There was no shock, no anger, just a profound sense of relief. I was out. The first few days were strange. I updated my resume, started looking at job postings, but my heart wasn't in it. Mostly I just waited. I knew it was coming. It was a mathematical certainty. About a week after I was fired, my phone rang. It was an unknown number. I answered, and it was the project lead from the client company, the guy I'd been forced to lie to for months. His voice was strained. He sounded like he hadn't slept in days. He said, "Sam, I know you don't work there anymore. I'm sorry to bother you at home, but I'm desperate." He told me the new team had missed the prototype deadline. They'd sent over an apology and a link to a demo environment. The client's technical team had spent a day trying to get it to work. It was completely non-functional. Buttons didn't work. Pages wouldn't load. The core features were just empty shells. He said his own bosses were furious and were talking about pulling the plug on the whole project. He asked me, off the record, what was really going on. I took a deep breath. I wasn't an employee anymore. I had no obligation to protect Stella or her narrative. So I told him. I told him everything about Victor being fired, about the experienced engineers who quit, about the incompetent new hires, about my warnings being ignored, about the report I gave Stella. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Finally, he just said, "I knew it. I knew something was fundamentally broken over there." He thanked me for my honesty and said he had to go make some difficult calls. After that, I heard nothing for a couple of weeks. I started getting interviews. It was a weird feeling, talking to other companies, trying to explain why I left my last job without sounding bitter or crazy. I settled on a story about a change in executive leadership and a new corporate direction that I didn't align with. It was the truth, just a sanitized version of it. Then, one Tuesday afternoon, the world exploded. I got a text from a friend who still worked at the company in a different department. All it said was, "It happened." I went online. The news was already starting to break on tech industry sites. Our former biggest client had suffered a catastrophic system-wide failure. Their entire logistics and ordering platform was down. The initial reports were blaming a faulty software update pushed by one of their vendors. I knew, with absolute certainty, who that vendor was. My phone started buzzing with messages from former colleagues. The story they pieced together was even worse than I could have imagined. Stella, facing pressure from the client after the failed prototype, had ordered the new team to push a good faith update to the client's live production system. Not a demo, not a staging environment. The actual live system that ran their entire business. The team, in their arrogance and inexperience, had done it. They had bypassed all the standard testing protocols and safety checks that Victor's team had spent years building and refining. The update contained a deeply flawed database query. The moment it went live, it didn't just crash the system. It started actively corrupting the client's primary transaction database. It was writing garbage data over years of order histories, customer information, and inventory records. It was a digital apocalypse. By the time the client's internal team realized what was happening and pulled the plug, the damage was done. Years of critical business data potentially gone forever. The client wasn't just losing money from the downtime. They were facing the complete destruction of their operational records. The fallout was immediate and brutal. The client's CEO called our board of directors directly. I heard he was screaming so loud, you could hear him down the hall from the boardroom. Lawyers were involved within hours. The initial damage estimate was in the tens of millions, and climbing. An emergency board meeting was called for the next morning. Stella apparently walked into that meeting with her usual air of unshakable confidence. She had her narrative all prepared. She tried to blame me and Victor. She claimed our report was part of a coordinated campaign of sabotage. She argued that the old system was so poorly documented and fragile that her new, brilliant team was set up to fail. She presented a story where she was the heroic change agent, battling against the entrenched, bitter forces of the past. For a few minutes, some of the board members, the ones who had been charmed by her buzzwords from the beginning, were buying it. Then, the chairman of the board patched in a conference call. On the other end of the line was the CEO of the client company, their chief technology officer, and a team of their lawyers. They had spent the night doing a full forensic analysis of the server logs. They had irrefutable time-stamped proof of exactly what had happened. They could show the exact moment the unauthorized update was pushed. They could show the login credentials of the junior developer who did it. They had copies of the deployment scripts, which were filled with amateurish errors. And they had the smoking gun, a chain of emails which they had demanded from Stella's own servers, showing her personally ordering the team to bypass protocol and push the update to the live environment against the desperate protests of the client's own technical liaison. She had put it in writing. The CTO of the client company walked the board through the technical evidence piece by piece. He did it in a calm, cold, surgical voice. He didn't yell. He didn't need to. The facts were devastating. He explained in simple terms that even a non-technical board member could understand how Stella's team had displayed a level of incompetence that was not just unprofessional, but borderline criminal. When he was finished, there was dead silence in the boardroom. Stella's narrative had been completely and utterly obliterated by a wall of pure, undeniable fact. She had nowhere to hide. No buzzwords could save her. She tried to speak, to offer some kind of rebuttal, but the chairman cut her off. He told her she was fired, effective immediately. He told her to hand over her company phone and laptop. He informed her that the company's lawyers would be in contact regarding her role in the impending lawsuit. Security was called to the boardroom. 2 guards escorted her back to her office, watched her pack a single small box of personal items, and then walked her out of the building, right through the middle of the open plan office in front of everyone. The reign of terror was over, but the company was on life support. They had lost their biggest client. They were facing a lawsuit that could bankrupt them. Their reputation in the industry was completely destroyed. Employee morale was at rock bottom. The board was in full-blown panic mode. That evening, I got a call from a number I hadn't seen in 6 months. It was Victor. His voice sounded exactly the same, tired, gruff, no nonsense. He said, "Sam, you hear what happened?" I told him I had. He told me the chairman of the board had called him an hour earlier. They had offered him his old job back. They had offered him a massive pay rise. They had begged. Victor had let them grovel for a while. Then he told them his terms. He didn't just want his old job back. He wanted a new title, Chief Technical Officer, with a seat on the executive board. He wanted complete, unquestionable authority over all engineering decisions and hiring. No more interference from synergy departments. He wanted them to publicly issue a formal apology to him and every one of the engineers who had been forced out. He wanted them to fire every single one of Stella's new hires in the engineering department, immediately. And he wanted them to give him the budget to rehire his entire old team at a 30% premium over what they were making at their new jobs. The board, desperate and with no other options, agreed to every single one of his demands. Then he said to me, "So, the first person I want to bring back is you, but not as a project manager." He offered me the position of Director of Engineering Operations. I'd be his second in command. My job would be to rebuild the processes, manage the client relationships, and make sure a disaster like this could never, ever happen again. He said, "I need someone who knows how to translate and who I can trust. Are you in?" I didn't even have to think about it. "I'm in," I said. The next Monday, Victor and I walked back into that office. It felt surreal. The atmosphere was like a morgue. The pastel-colored posters were still on the walls, but they seemed to mock the silence. Stella's hand-picked team was gone. Their desks were empty. The few remaining employees looked at us like we were ghosts. We went into the main engineering area. The whiteboards were still covered in the incomprehensible diagrams and buzzwords of the new team. Victor walked up to the biggest whiteboard, picked up an eraser, and wiped the whole thing clean. He didn't say a word. He just cleaned it. It was a symbolic act. The reset button had been hit. He turned to me and said, "All right, let's get to work. Call the old team. I've got a client to call." He went into his old office, which had been Stella's office for the past 6 months, and got on the phone with the CEO of the client company. I spent the rest of the day on the phone, calling the guys who had quit. Every single one of them said yes, they were coming back. The week after, the old team was back at their desks. It was like a reunion. The mood was somber but focused. The scale of the mess we had to clean up was enormous. The client, on the strength of Victor's personal guarantee, had agreed to pause the lawsuit on one condition: that we fix the system. We spent the next few months in the trenches, working 12-hour days, weekends. We weren't just fixing bugs. We were systematically undoing the damage, untangling the mess of bad code, restoring data from backups. It was the hardest work any of us had ever done. But there was no complaining. There was no drama. There was just a quiet, shared understanding of the mission. We were the professionals, here to fix the disaster caused by amateurs. Slowly, painstakingly, we brought the system back to life. We stabilized it. We rebuilt the client's trust, one successfully restored data table at a time. One evening, about 3 months into the recovery effort, I was walking out of the office late with Victor. We were both exhausted. We stood in the parking lot for a minute. I asked him if he ever thought about what Stella was doing now. He took a sip from his coffee thermos and looked up at the company logo on the side of the building. He said, "No, I try not to think about people who talk for a living. We're the people who build things. That's all that matters." And he was right. She had come in with a grand vision built on words and ideology. She had broken everything. We were the ones who stayed and fixed it, with logic, with experience, and with hard work. In the end, that's the only thing that actually keeps the lights on.